kick things off by saying welcome to another Mass Medic virtual program. I'm Rachel Robinson, Vice President of Mass Medic, and it's very nice to see all of you again. Thank you so much for taking time this morning to join us, and I know you're going to get a lot out of today's topic. This actually came about because Sean and I were chatting a while back as we prepped for a number of our FDA-focused panels and conferences, and the topic of products liability came up. And it was one of those things where we get questions so often from our members about how to protect themselves, obviously against legal entanglements, liability, lawsuits. And so this seemed like a really great time to take advantage of Sean's background and experience and hopefully share some really great knowledge with you today. So just a couple of quick reminders. We will be recording the session, so please keep an eye out for that. We'll send it to you after the program. Additionally, we highly encourage questions. The best way to ask questions, please send them in real time throughout. So if Sean is going over something, we can pause and answer questions. There's the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That's the best way to get questions in. And so we will absolutely stop and handle those as much as we can in real time. There'll also be a few minutes left over at the end for general questions. So with that, I'm going to introduce Sean Burke at Duane Morris and turn things over to him.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rachel. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining this morning. I'm excited for this opportunity to talk to you all about the topic of products liability and the threat of products liability to the medical device industry in particular. My name is Sean Burke, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Products Liability Trial Division at the law firm of Duane Morris. I'm in our Washington, D.C. office, but we have offices all over the country, and I focus my practice on defending and advising medical device clients against the threat and risks of products liability exposure. And as an attorney who focuses his practice on the medical device industry, I often attend industry conferences and discussions such as this. And a lot of the legal topics I see as one of the few lawyers, or a lot of the questions I get from those in attendance, really have nothing to do with products liability. And I get it. I understand that a company's goals, especially a newer company's goals, are to try to secure investors and get a product to market as quickly as possible. And so those goals generally align themselves more with questions around regulatory review or patent protection, intellectual property protection. And that makes sense. But there's another major risk out there that's often overlooked. And that's this threat, as Rachel mentioned, of products liability. The idea that a patient can be injured and that they'll claim that their injuries were caused by your company's product. And it can result in litigation, and that litigation can threaten not only the product line itself, but the entire company. And so today, we're going to spend some time talking about products liability litigation and give you basically an overview here, a crash course within that hour. And as Rachel mentioned, a lot of these topics we'll be going through kind of quickly. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. I think it's helpful to keep this as a dialogue, and I'm happy to answer them as they come up. Definitely don't worry about interrupting me. And so I'm going to start with kind of setting the stage. Why does this matter? Why is it important? And talk about some of the trends, the recent direction that the medical device litigation is going, and why this should be on the forefront of every company's mind. And then I'll spend some time talking about why certain products are brought into litigation, what drives litigation, what the plaintiff's bar is looking for. I'll then spend a little bit of time on the products liability 101 section. I'll go over some of the claims and theories that the plaintiffs have to prove, just so you understand kind of what the context is in which we're discussing these topics today. A little bit about FDA evidence, because I know that's always on everyone's forefront, and sometimes there's some misconceptions about how strong or how weak FDA evidence may be in defending against these claims. Then we'll spend some time talking about some best practices, some things that you can do, especially even during your development stages or your pre-litigation stages, that can really help mitigate the risk or the threat of litigation. And then maybe if we have time, depending on the number of questions, we'll talk a little bit about some case studies and kind of show you how these play out in real life. And so that's the agenda for today. Before we get into that, though, just one disclaimer that I'll give. Some of this may sound like a doomsday scenario, and that's certainly not my intent with this discussion here today. The reality is that the majority of medical devices, historically and currently on the market, make it through their product life cycle without any major products liability exposure. But as more and more plaintiffs' attorneys turn their practice to medical device litigation. And as the public narrative that gets advanced out there, unfortunately, through things like the bleeding edge, becomes more and more prominent, the target on the back of medical device companies gets bigger and bigger. And so really my goal with this discussion and other discussions I've given on the same topic really falls into the knowledge is power bucket. And that's this idea of kind of identifying some of the risks, giving you some ideas and thoughts on how to protect yourselves. Because if you can understand the soft spots, then you can take certain precautions. You can take very small steps during this development phase that can best position the company and hopefully protect it in the future. So that's the goal for today. So with that said, let's get some of the doomsday stuff out of the way right away. And we'll kind of talk about trends in litigation and kind of set the stage, why this matters and why you as a company really should care. And so this first slide here really just talks about the types of products liability actions, but really historically, even as few as 10 years ago, medical device claims were pretty straightforward. It'd usually be a single plaintiff. They would be hurt. They'd sue the company, and the case would really focus on that plaintiff, their injuries, and their story. And not that that's insignificant, but that would usually be the playing field, and there weren't that many of these cases filed. Well, fast forward to today, and the plaintiff's bar has become much more organized. And it's no longer just a handful of cases. There's thousands of cases out there. And the focus is no longer on the plaintiff. The focus instead is on the company. It's a shift in theories. It's a psychological shift that the plaintiff's bar has adopted. It's been very successful, and I won't bore you with all the details, but it's called the Reptile Theory. And the idea is that if you can scare the jury into thinking that there's some bad actor out there, that their natural instinct will be to protect themselves. And the way they protect themselves is by awarding huge verdicts. And so no longer is the whole story and theme going to be about this plaintiff. Instead, it's going to be on this company and how they bury the head in the sand, or how they ignored some of the trends and they kept selling this product for a profit. And the results have been very good for the plaintiff's bar using this theory. And the proof's in the pudding. I mean, this chart here, it's kind of a field of dreams chart, as I call it. If you build it, they will come. But you can see, as few as in the mid 2000s, the number of medical device lawsuits filed in federal courts across the country, were somewhat low, around 1,000, maybe a little more than 1,000. But then you fast forward here until 2012, and there's just an explosion. 90,000, 95,000 lawsuits filed every year against medical devices. And so what changed? Well, really it's this advent here. You can see the initials MDL. And a lot of people ask questions about class actions. Class actions usually are not available for medical devices in a products liability setting because there's not enough overlap in facts, because every patient's failure is different given the number of variables. But instead, what they invented was something called a multi-district litigation. The idea being that all of the claims filed across the country against this product can all be put before one judge for the purposes of discovery. The idea was supposed to benefit companies with the, so an employee would only have to go through a deposition one time as opposed to having to go through it 15 to 25 times. And in theory, that sounded like a great idea for companies. Unfortunately, what's happened is an explosion of lawsuits. And that's because these are economically attractive cases to plaintiffs' attorneys. If you can file your case in this large MDL and then sit back while the leadership, counsel conducts all the discovery and then eventually get a settlement, the risk benefit to you as an attorney is very good. And as a result, there have just been an explosion of these cases. They actively advertise and seek them out. And that's why we see the growing trend we have today. And it's not just that there's a large number of cases, the verdicts have also gone up. And so as you can see here, billion-dollar verdicts, multi-million-dollar verdicts, this has become a major business. So what can we learn? What's the takeaway from all this? Well, as I said, the number of claims is increasing and the verdicts are getting larger. And so as a result, the stakes are getting higher. Excuse me, some of the bigger companies, not only smaller companies, but bigger companies too feel this. Bigger companies may be able to take a couple of these cases to trial to try to drive down settlement value and then reach a big settlement and be done with it. But for smaller companies and even medium companies or even some bigger companies, this becomes bet the company type litigation where you can't try your way out of 1,000 lawsuits and you may not be able to settle 1,000 lawsuits because some of these settlements are huge as well. And so you're left in a very difficult predicament. And so that's kind of what's at stake. That's what I want to set the stage for today. And so we know what can go wrong. So let's talk about, well, why it goes wrong. What are the drivers of litigation? And you can see here, there's just a couple examples of why certain lawsuits are filed. Maybe media attention, pending litigation, or recalls of other competitive products, field actions from the company, a company's recall, obviously, FDA action, the list goes on and on. And what I thought would be helpful, though, is to kind of walk through how these factors have played out in a real life scenario. And one of the biggest litigations of a medical device over the past 10 years, I'd say, involved metal-on-metal hip implants. And I think metal-on-metal hip implants, the story of them really kind of shows how a litigation can explode very quickly. And so metal-on-metal hip implants, for those of you who are not aware, were one of the most common hip implants used in the 2006, 2007, 2008 timeframe. Around 2010, there are some complaints of failures. And one Sunday in the New York Times, a feature article was put out talking about patients being poisoned by metal in their hips. And so that was the media. And then sure enough, more failures happened. And then there's a recall by one of the products. The ASR was recalled. That recall was then followed by the FDA jumping in and looking at metal on metal as a whole and holding meetings and issuing letters for follow-up studies and additional post-market surveillance. That was then followed by the scientific literature jumping in and more articles and more studies about the dangers of metal on metal. That was followed by an increase in reporting on the MOD database from the FDA. More and more surgeons started questioning metal on metal. Surgeons who worked with these companies were now disavowing it and saying, if I knew what the company knew, I never would have used this product. You put all of that together, and suddenly not just the ASR, but every single company that offered a metal-on-metal implant was embroiled in litigation. And it went from a handful of lawsuits probably in 2010 to thousands in 2012. And so that's how quickly this can escalate. And that's because it becomes a very big business. I talked a little bit about attorney advertising and plaintiff law firm advertising. But the other piece of it is also this idea of litigation funding. And that's that there are investment companies out there that look for opportunities to buy into litigation, and they float money to plaintiffs' counsel with either a high interest rate or a high percentage of return, depending on the settlement or any verdict received. And so this has become, there's funding behind them, they have deep pockets, and it's become a big business. And I say all of this as another caveat, by certainly no means to be critical of plaintiffs' attorneys. There's obviously a lot of legitimate claims out there. Plaintiffs' attorneys all care very much about their clients and getting them great results. But the reality of the situation is this: is a lot of the way the playing field is now favors plaintiffs' attorneys and at the risk of medical device clients. And so that's just the reality of the situation and what we as an industry have to deal with. So I want to switch gears now. We've talked a little bit about what drives litigation, and I want to talk about some of the claims themselves and the types of products liability claims out there. And really, they fall within three buckets. There's strict liability claims, and those require no showing of fault. They just have to show the product was defective. The other theory out there is negligence, and that requires some showing of fault. The standard, really, the hallmark of a negligence claim is reasonableness. Did the manufacturer act as a reasonably prudent manufacturer would? And the third bucket of claims that does require showing of fault, it requires often a showing of intent. Those are fraud claims. The company was reckless or wanton or acted with an evil mind. Those are obviously the most dangerous of claims. But for today's purposes, and the most common claims that you see, and the ones that are the easiest to defend against up front, are the strict liability and negligence claims. So I'm going to focus most of my discussion this morning on those two buckets. When we talk about strict liability claims, we're really talking about a defect. The plaintiff has to show that the product was defective. And really, there are three buckets in which a product can be defective. It can be defective in its design, it can be defective in manufacturing, or it can be defective in its warnings, its labeling. That's a failure to warn claim. So I'm going to take each of these in turn. And the first one is is a design defect. And that claim really centers around an alleged defect where the manufacturer could have reduced a foreseeable risk by adopting a reasonable and economically feasible alternative design. And how these claims really come down to is what's called the risk utility test. And the court or the jury is going to look at the benefits versus the risks. And do the benefits outweigh the risks? And also while looking, was there another alternative design that could have been used that would have reduced these risks. So going back to the metal on metal example, what the plaintiffs would argue is the benefit of metal on metal was minimal. The risk of metal on metal was high, especially when you consider the potential toxic effects of metal ions. And then you balance that against the fact that there was another reasonable alternative on the market. There are plastics, there are ceramics, and that was the design defect claim in a nutshell on those cases. The other thing I'll just note on all three of these claims, there is no sort of federal standards for products liability or for strict liability. These are all determined on a state-by-state basis, and every state's laws differ. But for the most part, they all kind of follow the same sort of playbook on each of the three types of defect claims available to a plaintiff. The next bucket of claims are manufacturing defect claims. And these are claims that there was some sort of deviation from the design during the manufacturing process. And these are dangerous claims. These are difficult claims for a company to defend against, because if the plaintiff can prove that something went wrong during the manufacturing process, that this device in particular deviated from its design, it's hard to show that the company's not liable. The good news is these are also very difficult for a plaintiff to prove. These can be ascertained either through trying to compare the subject device to a properly manufactured item. A lot of companies have batch records, device history records. You can review those records and see if there's any sort of deviation. Otherwise, they have to have an expert who's going to inspect the device and find some deviation that they can claim happened during the manufacturing process. So these claims are expensive, and as a result, they're often pled. They're not often followed through. But again, a very dangerous claim to be mindful of. And the third bucket are failure to warn claims. And these are claims that there is some sort of defect or failure in the company's warnings. And the standard that the companies are held to is that a manufacturer should provide adequate warnings when it's known or reasonably ought to be known that a product is unsafe for its use by expected or intended users. And again, these are very dangerous claims, because when you're standing in front of a jury, they're always going to believe that there's something more you could have said. That even if you have a warning in about this product may break, you didn't say how it would break, or you didn't say if you're doing this activity, it would break. And so it's very difficult to say, well, we've warned against every foreseeable risk, when the jury's going to believe there's always more that could be done. And the other thing I note here as well is it's also a moving target. And so what you know when you first issue your warnings is one thing, but you're constantly getting complaints. There's constantly going to be post-market surveillance. There's going to be new literature reports. And what warrants updating those warnings? How do you know when you need to issue new warnings? And you'll be charged with knowing of every little complaint in front of a jury. So again, it becomes a very difficult standard, because everyone in the industry knows it's not feasible that every time you get some sort of new product complaint in your complaint reporting process, that you can't go update the warnings. But that's the standard that the plaintiff's bar will often try to hold you to, which makes these claims difficult. The other point I would just want to make on failure to warn claims, as many of you know, there's no duty under the law to warn the patient directly. The manufacturer's duty to warn extends only to the surgeon or to the treating physician. And that doctrine is commonly referred to as the learned intermediary doctrine. The idea that you have this sort of learned intermediary, this doctor, this well-educated scientist in the middle, that's where your duty to warn extends to. And then it's up to the doctor to then convey those warnings to the patient. And so oftentimes one of the best defenses that we have is the warnings that accompany the products. Most doctors will say, I don't even read them. And if they don't read them, then there is no causation. And that often is a defense to these claims. So those are your strict liability claims. I'll just very briefly touch upon negligence. That's the other major bucket of products liability claims out there. And again, the hallmark of a negligence claim is reasonableness. And so as a result, it's a very broad bucket of claims, and plaintiffs can get very creative with what type of negligence claim they bring. They can bring them in the same type of format that they bring a strict liability claim. Again, the difference is negligence requires some showing of fault, while strict liability does not. You can have negligent design, negligent manufacturing, negligent failure to warn. But you can also have negligent testing, negligent inspection, negligent training of your sales reps. I've seen all those types of claims. And so within negligence, the plaintiff's bar has a little more flexibility to tailor a claim to whatever allegations they think they may have. So that's the very basic overview of the law and some of the claims and the elements required under the various strict liability and negligence theories. The other thing I want to spend a few minutes talking about are FDA issues at trial. And that's because I get a lot of questions from those in the industry who say, well, isn't my FDA compliance, isn't that some of the best evidence, or doesn't that even get me immunity from some of these lawsuits? And the very broad answer is it depends. So I'm sure as many of you on the call are aware, there are many different pathways in which a device can be brought to market. One of the ways is a PMA approval. That's the pre-market approval process. That's obviously the most rigorous of the FDA review. With that, though, does come preemption, and that's immunity from several of the various claims that a plaintiff can advance. Not all claims, because they still may have negligent misrepresentation claims or fraud type claims, but oftentimes your design claims, your warning claims, those would be preempted, again, depending on the state. But as many of you know, the most common pathway in which devices are brought to the market is actually the 510K clearance process. And plaintiffs fully understand that FDA evidence is some of the best evidence that a medical device company may have. And knowing that, again, knowing how well organized the plaintiff's bar is, they've engaged on a narrative to kind of attack that 510K clearance process. And again, I'm sure you're familiar with the bleeding edge, but also This Week in John Oliver has really painted that 510K process using the same narrative plaintiff advanced as a loophole, as a shortcut, as an end around, that it doesn't require any finding of safety and efficacy. It just requires some finding or some statement that your product is just like another product that's already on the market. And that narrative has been very successful. In fact, many courts do not even allow evidence of 510K clearance in a trial. And this is just an example. This is from the Supreme Court of the United States, and it shares their views on the 510K process. And as you can see here at the very bottom, Section 510K notification requires little information, rarely elicits a negative response from the FDA, and gets processed very quickly. Now, this comment was in the context of preemption, but the plaintiff's bar has used this line from the Supreme Court to, in essence, argue that there is no relevance at all to 510K clearance at trial. And they argue that there's no finding of safety and efficacy. And then on the flip side, it's very prejudicial to plaintiffs because it will put the words FDA around this evidence when the Food and Drug Administration really did not conduct any review at all. And now I'm sure all of us on the call know that that's not true, that the 510K process is not a rubber stamp, that it requires a significant investment, not only in time, but in money from the company, that oftentimes the FDA engages in a dialogue back and forth, asking questions. You submit testing, you submit your warnings. There's a lot that goes into this process. Unfortunately, there's a misconception out there right now, and a lot of times this evidence does not even make it in front of the jury. And so you're left in a very unenviable position of the plaintiff arguing the company didn't act reasonably, they rushed the product to market, and you can't utter the words FDA. And that makes it very difficult to defend some of these cases. The good news is the narrative is starting to change a little bit, and there have been some recent favorable decisions. There's often been some push in legislatures in various states to try to change this narrative. Rachel, is there a question?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as someone who works with a lot of companies with 510Ks, it's slightly terrifying. So the question that came in is a really good one. So many of us are suppliers to med device manufacturers. To what extent does liability extend to a manufacturer's suppliers of things like components or design testing services?
Sure, and that's a great question. And so generally speaking, the concept in the law that touches upon this is something known as the chain of distribution or the chain of sale or the design chain. And so a supplier of a raw material, for example, is considered by many states to be in that supply chain. And so they can be technically named in any lawsuit. Generally speaking, as a practical matter, it doesn't often happen. However, there may be reasons in which they are named, and I have seen them named. And so it's if the plaintiff bar can find them. And so oftentimes they're going to name the manufacturer, because the manufacturer is the forward-facing entity. That's who's going to be on the sticker sheet. That's who's going to be shown as manufacturing the product. But when they get into discovery, and I've seen this in plenty of the cases, they find out who those manufacturers were. And if the material is in the crosshairs, like the cobalt chromium and metal on metal, they could find those companies, and then they'll make a decision whether or not it makes sense to them to name them. There could be all sorts of reasons why they'd want to name a supplier. It could be that they like the location the supplier is in, and they'd rather be in that court. It could be that by naming that supplier, they get to keep the case in state court. So it's not necessarily an issue of fault. It's really just a strategical issue. So they absolutely can be on the hook. And what I often advise suppliers is to take a careful look at your contracts. So you're going to have a contract with the manufacturer. You're going to want to understand how indemnity works there. A lot of times there is indemnity. And a lot of times the manufacturer will take the liability in certain circumstances, but there may be circumstances when you as a manufacturer have the liability. So you want to understand that. And I say that more so now than ever before, when there are disruptions in the supply chain from the pandemic. And I think, people will get comfortable with their supply contracts. And they're like, well, I know the practice. We've been doing business with them for years. But when, quotas are getting tight, and during the pandemic, when people are put up against a wall, they may try to enforce the rule and letter of those contracts. So I always advise supplier clients to take a careful look, even at your existing contracts, and make sure you understand your obligations both ways.
And the follow-up then is even more, a little bit more in depth. What about the design? So can designers and engineering, houses kind of be brought into this? If they are not really directly, they're not a supplier per se, right? They're a service provider. Can the designers of the product be brought in, even if they are not the manufacturer or the medical device company?
Unfortunately, 100%, yes. And in fact, it's in one of the biggest litigations I've had, unfortunately, the design surgeon whose life work was designing this product was brought in as an individual. And again, not because they were going after him personally because of deep pockets, but because they liked the location he was in. He was located in California. California is a very plaintiff-friendly state. And so they named him in thousands of lawsuits. And so in that situation, he had an indemnity agreement with the company. The company honored that. And they paid for his defense and handled it. However, he's still getting served at his house with thousands of lawsuits. He's being deposed. His name is being dragged through in every single filing and every single article. And so regardless of maybe it not being a financial hit, it was not a very pleasant experience. And so, yes. So again, I would suggest designers take a careful look at their contracts and understand sort of those indemnity obligations, but just knowing that they can be, unfortunately, on the hook as well.
Okay, one last follow-up, and it's maybe too in-depth for
no, we can do it.
your
it's good.
background. How much does having a quality system that falls under FDA's guidance and regulations protect suppliers, manufacturers, designers, or does it not, even especially because of a 510K process?
Sure. Well, actually, my next slide kind of goes over that a little bit. So I'll hop into that, and then I'm going to give some suggestions later on. But that's a great question. Obviously, I talked about clearance and how FDA 510K clearance can be excluded a child, but of course FDA oversight is predominant over all medical device operations. And so in addition to clearance, there's often quality issues as well. And one of the best pieces of evidence that you can put forth at a trial is evidence of your complaint data, because plaintiffs like to pick sound bites. Well, this surgeon says he had 5 failures. And without any registry or formal registry here in the United States, some of the best sources of data are the company's own internal reporting. And so having a FDA compliant post-market surveillance group or complaint analysis group can be extremely helpful. Of course, the plaintiff's bar recognizes the strength of this, and they work very hard at trying to undermine this evidence as well. And this is just an example. There was, I'm not sure if you saw this, but the FDA had a secondary database that was not public, only for specific types of products. It was very limited, but this was, dubbed the quote unquote secret database, and that the FDA was hiding information from the public. And so this was a narrative that plaintiffs advanced, and again, to try to undermine the FDA's quality control oversight. But obviously, in addition to just complaint analysis, the FDA quality is going to look over the inspection, your manufacturing processes, and those are all very helpful evidence at trial. For example, I'll talk a little bit about your device history records, your lot manufacturing records, that quality control is usually overseen by the FDA, and that type of evidence is hugely relevant at trial and can be extremely helpful at trial. Now, I have seen instances where the court says you're not allowed to mention the FDA at all, but at least you can still talk about these quality programs. You may not be able to say they are endorsed by the FDA, but in most instances, the idea of FDA exclusion is really limited to the clearance, not necessarily to the compliance on the back end. And so
Okay,
I'm going to switch gears now. Yeah, go ahead.
Before we move on, we did have a couple more questions come in. So you were talking a bit about registration. Are there certain states that are better to register a medtech company?
It's difficult to say. I mean, yes and no. I mean, there are some states, for example, that don't allow for the award or have limits on the award of punitive damages, like Nebraska randomly is one. But it also doesn't matter necessarily where you register, so to speak, because it's often going to be, you'll oftentimes be sued where the injury occurs. So if you sell the product to someone, even though you may be an Indiana company, if you sell the product to somebody in Kentucky, the plaintiff can decide, well, do I want to sue this company in Kentucky, or do I want to sue them in Indiana where it's manufactured, or do I want to go find somebody else like a design surgeon and argue they should be sued there? And we'd have a lot of defenses. There are now higher standards for personal jurisdiction as to where a complaint can be filed. The courts have a lot of concerns over this idea of quote unquote forum shopping, that is allowing the plaintiff to try to pick the best venue for their claims. And so they have, and starting with the Supreme Court, have really cracked down on this. So it's harder to forum shop, but it's still very much an issue. And so it's not as simple as just, hey, I'm only licensed, I'm incorporated in Massachusetts. I mean, yes, I guess you can say I'm only going to sell in states that have favorable laws, but that's obviously significantly limiting your business. And every state has products liability litigation, so it's not like you're going to get immunity anywhere.
Well, one last question, and this was an anonymous one. How does Massachusetts stack up in terms of plaintiff friendly or defendant friendly when it comes to these kinds of things?
Yeah, I think Massachusetts is fairly neutral. They don't have some of the more favorable things. And I mean, interestingly enough, one of the most favorable states, at least on the front end, it is actually California, because they actually have immunity, blanket immunity from strict liability design defect claims for medical devices. They're the only state that has this. It's under a doctrine of what's called unavoidably unsafe, recognizing that medical devices are going to have risks no matter what. And so California actually says you can't be held strictly liable for design, at least. Massachusetts doesn't have that. Some states, like I mentioned, have some pretty good caps on damages. Massachusetts doesn't have that. But generally speaking, the juries are considered to be pretty good in Massachusetts because it's such a hotbed of medical device companies. A lot of people know, the benefits of medical devices in Massachusetts. And so typically it's a fairly favorable place to be. The laws themselves are not overly favorable, but the juries are considered to be some of the better jaws you can have.
Okay, thanks. I'll let you get back.
Yeah, no worries. I'm happy to keep having the discussion. It makes it more interactive and I think more helpful to the audience, hopefully. So we've talked about some of the claims at issue. I just now want to get into some of and a lot of these were touched upon by your great questions, but some of the ideas and thoughts and ways to maybe prevent some of this litigation. And obviously, again, this is a future risk. It's something we're looking about, down the road, but there are little things you can do now that may be helpful. And I recognize that not all companies, have the resources or the time to do this up front. I realize, as I said in the beginning, especially startup companies, they're charged by their CEOs and higher ups to get this product to market as quickly and efficiently as possible. And taking time to slow down to maybe, make a more robust regulatory filing or a more robust design file may not necessarily be high in the cards. But it's a balancing act for all of us and to try to figure out, where there is something you can do that will be helpful to a future product's liability risk, while at the same time still keeping the company's goals on target of getting this product to market. And so we'll start with our design claims and design defect claims. And I think the most important thing to consider here is you want your design files to really tell the product story. And this begins in the development phase. Obviously, every product is developed for a reason. And you want to make sure you're carefully documenting that reason. You're identifying the need for that product, why your product addresses concerns or doesn't have risks of other products. And the example I give, again, going back to the metal on metal litigation, right now, of course, metal on metal seems like a bad idea. But at the time it was developed in 2005, there were serious concerns in the hip implant industry over the other materials being used. Plastic was wearing out. It was causing osteolysis. Ceramics were breaking. They would cause squeaking, which is very annoying. And metal on metal had been used before. And while there were failures, it was largely because they couldn't get the tolerances right because the manufacturing technology wasn't there. But when the tolerances were right, some of these products were lasting 20, 30 years. And so the industry as a whole thought, you know what, we can go back to metal on metal, and this could be a big benefit. And so, right now, the problem with products liability claims is oftentimes you're judged 10 years later, and you're standing in front of a jury, and what may have been a good idea 10 years ago seems like a terrible idea today. And so you want to think of your design files or even your regulatory files as kind of a time capsule. And so if there's certain literature you're relying upon, if there's studies you're relying upon when you're developing a product, put them in the file, consider documenting them, make sure they're there. And that way, when you're standing in front of a jury, and I've had the benefit of this, and in that design file is a summary of the literature at the time you're designing it, you can walk through the jury and say, look, this is what the medical literature was saying at the time. There is no discussion of toxicity or metal poisoning. This was a very promising technology. If you can do that, then that puts you in an advantage. And again, that's something that's simple enough because I'm sure your product is supported by research, and making sure that research is well organized in a design file that then can be used down the road is hugely important. The other thing I would mention is just the importance of standards. ASTM and ISO standards, we all follow these, but to the extent you can document what standards you're following, that's hugely helpful. The juries latch on to standards, and if you can present to them and ensure them that the company was not out there just making up tests or winging it, but instead following these ASTM and ISO standards, and these are the standards the FDA expects you to comply with, that's hugely beneficial as well. And I already touched upon it, but also this idea of understanding the state of the art. And that's the idea of what is the state of the art at the time. You can't be judged by 10 years down the road. You're only judged by what you knew and what the state of the art was at the design process. So just keeping that in mind and documenting sort of the risks and benefits of your product, and also the risks and benefits of the products already on the market, can go a long way in defending against some of these design defect claims. And then the other thing I would mention would also be, take advantage of the FDA, some of the FDA programs out there, in particular the Fda Pre-Submission Process. I mentioned before that many times, unfortunately, FDA 510K evidence may not get in. But to the extent that you can show a court that this was not some sort of rubber stamp, that this was years of an ongoing dialogue that even started with a pre-submission meeting and getting direction from the FDA, and then was followed by a careful submission with warnings and testing to the FDA. And the FDA asked questions, and then the company responded with its answers, and the FDA cleared it. That's a dialogue that you can show is not a rubber stamp, and that absolutely goes to safety and efficacy, and that may go a long way into getting that file in at trial. And once you have that file in at trial, oftentimes that goes a very long way in securing a defense verdict, because a jury has an expectation that these products went through the FDA process, and when they don't hear it, that's a bad outcome for defendants often. But when they do hear it, especially in current light of the pandemic, when more focus has been on the FDA than ever before, and more people understand that these medicines, these devices, they take time, and the FDA is involved, and they're looking at everything carefully. I think more than ever, the jury is going to be aware of that, and if you can get them into evidence, I think it'll be very beneficial to companies. And so the next, that's on design, talking a little bit about manufacturing. As I mentioned before, manufacturing defect claims are difficult claims oftentimes to defend against. But one of the best pieces of evidence that you can have are your device history records. And I'm sure most companies you're required to have something, but how you keep them, I'm sure it depends from company to company. But these are your lot records, your batch records for each batch that's manufactured. And there's inspection in there, depending on how many units in each batch you inspect, but it goes through all of the testing. And this is just an example. This is from a court opinion here that is citing to the fact that the device history record does not show any quality or inspection issues, that when you look up that batch in the MOD database, there are no other reports against any complaint, or against any other product within that batch. And summary judgment was granted here because the DHRs, those device history records, carried the day. Another example I can give on this, and again, not to tell war stories, but we had a case in Seattle where the allegation was that the product was mislabeled. It was a hip implant case, where the head that was implanted was the wrong size compared to the cup. And the surgeon, who was also named, stood up and said, "There's no way that I would have made this mistake. The box must have been mislabeled." And we ended up having to go to trial in this case. And nobody had the box. The box, of course, was thrown away. And so the best piece of evidence that we had came from these device history records, because there were 24, I think, components in this batch. And they printed 25 labels. 24 of them went on the boxes. The 25th label went on the last page of that DHR. So we had an actual copy of the label that was used that showed that it was not mislabeled. And ultimately, the jury was out for not very long and came back with a verdict in our favor. But all of that was possible by a company keeping very detailed batch records and keeping a detailed example of what they put on that labeling. So we talked about design defect. We talked about some ideas around manufacturing claims. The third bucket, of course, are these failure to warn claims. And I think the biggest piece of advice I can give on failure to warn claims is just, and again, they all kind of rise upon and fall upon your warnings, your IFUs, your instructions for use that accompany the products. That's kind of your number one defense of these claims. And what I always tell companies who are considering drafting these is to make sure it's a team effort, that it's collaborative, that it's not just one department or one person drafting these, that it involves regulatory, it involves legal, it involves marketing, it involves R&D. You want as much input and oversight into these warnings as possible. The other suggestion I would make is that I've seen has been very powerful is, look, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of uncertainties. But if the literature at the time is reporting these unknowns, you can include that and just say, you know, this is a new material. The long-term effects of it are unknown, and that can go a long way in helping you. That's not necessarily putting anything out there that's going to deter anyone from using the product, but it's a type of warning that can cover you against a warning claim in the future. The other piece that goes to this area is your post-market surveillance, your complaint analysis, and then how you respond to complaints. Obviously, it's, as medical device companies know, you can't react to every single failure, but you need to start identifying trends, and that comes from post-market surveillance. And then it's a difficult decision of when something may amount to a trend that requires an update to your labeling, or requires a CAPA, or requires some additional follow-up. And again, that should be a cross-company effort. That should include legal, that should include your regulatory group, that should include R&D, and everyone should be on the same page there. But having a robust post-market surveillance plan and group can also really help defend against these claims, because they're looking at the whole picture. And you can say, yeah, so this surgeon had 2 failures, but you know, we have 99 other surgeons who reported no failures. And so the extent that you can keep that big picture in mind and have a detailed complaint analysis group is hugely important. And the other thing I would note here is responsiveness. I have it as my, I guess, 5th bullet, but responsiveness to customers. I can't stress this enough. Surgeon users and your customers are sometimes the most dangerous witnesses if they decide to become hostile towards the company. And a lot of times it stems from just what the surgeon feels is not a proper response to their concerns. And so I know every company obviously values their customers, but you want to make sure that your sales reps are well trained to report any concerns, that your sales reps are keeping you and corporate in the loop on any sort of complaints. Because if you can timely respond to these surgeons and say, hey, what are you seeing? And show them that you're paying attention and that you care about their complaints, that could prevent them from going off the rails. Because a lot of times what we see are surgeons who feel like their complaints are falling upon deaf ears, and they're emailing the company. And when they're not getting a response and they're seeing failures, they start referring their patients to lawyers. And then the lawyers start contacting them. And the next thing you know, one of your surgeon consultants is now the lead expert for the plaintiff. And that is a very difficult thing to overcome when you're forced to try to either attack this surgeon, where obviously you thought highly enough of him to hire him in the first place, or you just have to try to explain why he was having failures and nobody else was. And again, that's a very difficult hill to climb. And the other thing I would note, of course, is just the importance of sales rep training. Obviously, as I mentioned before, they're your outward facing group. They're the ones who are dealing on a day-to-day basis, with the surgeons. And so you want to make sure that you have training, a handbook, some sort of compliance, regular meetings, anything that you can point to. Because again, one of the best pieces of evidence you have is that complaint reporting. But your complaint reporting is only as good as the information you're getting. And so if your sales reps are not trained or do not know that they need to regularly report failures, that can result in numbers that the plaintiffs can easily poke holes in, because they can talk to the sales rep and he'll testify at his deposition, yeah, I wasn't very good at reporting them. Well, then those numbers don't mean anything, because the failures were not getting to the company if the hospitals, who often don't, were not reporting them. We have about 13 minutes left. Rachel, are there any questions? Otherwise, I can run through a case study.
No, I mean, we had a little more question, but about the 510K stuff, it just doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense, but I completely understand what you're saying. So I think there's probably some more clarity that people need around that, but that's a topic for a bigger conversation, I think, later.
Sure. And I think, and I'm looking at that question now, and I'll just give a little more detail on it, and then I'll just briefly talk about, 3D printing, just because I think it's an interesting future case study. But I think that, I guess the issue is the court is the gatekeeper of evidence, and it's the court's job to only put evidence in front of the jury that it believes will be helpful. And so this is not a finding by the court that the 510K process itself is not meritorious, even though that's, of course, what the underlying connotations are. But what the court is finding is just that the evidence of 510K clearance is not helpful to the jury. And how they evaluate that, how any evidence is evaluated by the court, is they have to balance it. They put it on a scale. And does the risk of prejudice of that evidence outweigh the probative value? And the probative value means the relativeness, or how relevant it is. And if they find that the potential prejudice outweighs the relevance, then they'll exclude it. And so the argument the plaintiffs advance is that the 510K process just is not probative of anything. It's not a finding of safety and efficacy, because they're not actually looking at that device itself. They're just comparing it to whether or not it's substantially equivalent to a device already on the market. And if it is, it meets that standard and it's approved. On the flip side, if the jury hears the letters FDA, they're going to assume that there is some sort of safety and efficacy finding, and they will affix unfair weight to that, to that clearance. And so courts weighing this oftentimes will say that's too prejudicial to the plaintiffs, and they'll exclude it. The good news is that the groups like Massmedic, other groups like AVAMed, they're very aware of this, and they have formed committees, and they are fighting this fight for all of us out there. And so are the lawyers, of course, in every brief we file. But there was a appeal taken in New Jersey. It was, I think, a barred case. They excluded all 510K evidence. They got blasted with their verdict. They appealed it. All of the device companies kind of hopped on board, some of the big ones, Stryker, J&J, and they helped with some of the briefing. They put in their 2 cents on the issue. And the court came and said that was an error, that you, especially in this post-pandemic world, you cannot exclude evidence of the FDA, because when you exclude evidence of the FDA, juries just assume it didn't go through that process, and you're going to get huge verdicts. And so I think that narrative is very helpful. It's one that's now being advanced, and my hope is that the tide is turning, and that more and more courts will start recognizing the value of 510K evidence, because it's the defendant's side of the story. It's their response to so many things, to punitive damages, to fraud claims, to negligence claims. And so it's critical evidence that hopefully more and more courts will start understanding is needed.
Awesome. And
so
the other
a few
question
minutes
that
left.
keeps coming in, is will you be able to share these slides afterwards?
Oh yeah, 100%. I will send them to you,
Okay.
Rachel, and I'll leave it to you as to how to best get those to the group. But happy to do so. And so in a few minutes left, if anyone has any questions, obviously hop in. Otherwise, I'll just give a few notes, because I think it's helpful to kind of look at, especially in today's world, where there's so many emerging technologies, so many exciting innovations. You have artificial intelligence, you have 3D printing, additive manufacturing, surgical robotics. It's really exciting times. But from a products liability standpoint, these emerging technologies, as I'll call them, they really present interesting case studies because a lot of them don't fit into traditional products liability parameters. The other problem is that they're moving so quickly that the FDA hasn't necessarily had a chance for its guidelines to catch up. Sure, they've issued some draft guidance, but they don't have the same sort of robust guidelines that they otherwise would have for traditionally manufactured or traditional devices. And the same holds true with standards. I mean, ASTM is working quickly on additive manufacturing, for example, but the same detailed standards that accompany traditional implants are just not there. And so it leaves device companies in kind of an unenviable position of where innovation is outpacing regulation and standards, and that leaves you somewhat unprotected. Obviously, you can all use your best judgment. Obviously, there are basic guidelines and standards that still apply, but there's a lot of things that just don't fit. And when you're dealing with unknowns, the risk of exposure may go up. And that's especially true, I think, with additive manufacturing when there's just so many questions out there. And this is something that's really picked up in recent years. Just a few examples of some of the products out there. And there's already been a recall, and I quickly saw when there was a recall that there was, of course, plaintiff advertising. So the plaintiffs are watching this very carefully because I think they see potential advantages with some of these emerging technologies. And so just walking through again through our design and manufacturing claims, and just again, this is just to kind of frame this with a future discussion. One of the issues with 3D printing, for example, you'll want to document why are you even 3D printing this product. We talked about the fact that if there's a reasonable alternative design, that could be a finding of liability. Well, in the context of 3D printing, there is a reasonably alternative design. You could have just manufactured this thing through traditional means. Why are you 3D printing it? And your answer shouldn't be, well, because it's cool or because I want to keep up with the Joneses. You want to think about what the advantage is. Can you print porous coating on an acetabular cup in a single print? Well, that might be a reason that justifies it. Obviously, because it allows for the customization of a device to fit a specific patient need. That's a good reason as well. And again, just some examples I have, one of the basic tenets of products liability is, you want to test the worst case scenario. That if you test the worst case scenario, that's often deemed to be sufficient testing. Well, what's the worst case scenario in a 3D printed or in an AI device where the parameters are really endless and it's up to the user? And so it just creates a lot of questions. The other thing I mentioned for 3D printing, manufacturing defects, so many questions and issues because there's so many variables. You can reuse materials. You may have to clear materials out before another print. And so there's so many variables that can cause a manufacturing defect that it leaves suppliers, it leaves manufacturers with a lot of issues. And then, warnings, especially in the context of point of care printing. And that's the idea that hopefully at some point, these 3D printed devices can maybe be printed to address a patient-specific need right at the hospital. But in that scenario, who has the duty to warn? What's even the product? Is the product the 3D printer? Is it the CAD file, the design drawings? Is it the actual product the hospital prints? And then then who's the manufacturer? Is it who designed the CAD file? Is it the manufacturer of the printer? Is it the hospital that prints the product right there on site? And so it leads to a lot of questions. There aren't necessarily answers right now. I've given talks specific to 3D printing, and I think it's important that everybody in that chain understands their potential liability and their potential for exposure. So again, this is just a very quick run through of just how some of the concepts we've been talking about today, how they may apply to some future technologies. I know a lot of companies are considering and working on right now that just aren't that developed by the law and just you want to be aware of.
We did have one last question come in, and I think it's probably a good one to end on. Do you have any thoughts on the most important criteria to evaluate product liability insurance companies?
Well, I think the most important criteria is you're just going to want to, and I am not a coverage counsel. I'm not insurance counsel, but we do deal with these issues. And so I think my number one piece of advice would be to consult coverage counsel. And because oftentimes what you see is you want to look at the liability insurance language. And I think you want to understand in particular, whether it's a claims made policy or it's a batch policy, because that could greatly impact how much coverage you receive. And so, for example, I've had clients who had, towers and towers of coverage, years and years of coverage, but because of the language of those policies, all the claims linked back to the first claim made against that product. And they are all dealt with as a batch. and that meant only one tower was implicated. And that resulted in years and years of litigation and some settlements that got them some of the proceeds, but they definitely did not get the insurance benefits they thought they would get. And so, at least from my perspective, and again, full caveat, not a insurance attorney, but I would pay careful attention to kind of that claims made batch language, because that's what can bite you when you think, oh, I got $100 million in products liability coverage, but for over these 5 years, but all the claims may be put in one bucket in 1 year, and that greatly limits the amount of coverage you thought you had.
That's great. Thank you. Sean, this has been a really, really great program. So thank you so much for putting this together and sharing your perspectives. Obviously, it's a huge topic, and one I'm hoping we can do more sessions on, because I think we could dive deep into, I don't know, every one of those high level topic slides that you threw out there.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's obviously a lot of information quickly. I will share the slides, Rachel, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to shed some light on this important topic. And if anyone has any questions or anything they want to discuss with me, please feel free to reach out. My contact information is here. Even though I'm in DC, I'm from New England originally. We have a Boston office. Happy to help. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Everyone have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.